As Christina reminded us, next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent, 4 Sundays prior to Christmas. And we will take a break from the book of Acts beginning next Sunday for the 4th Sunday of its Advent. So we'll enter today into the beginning of what is called the Counsel of Jerusalem in the 15th chapter of Acts. And rather than read the whole thing to you and try to deal with it, I wanted to just stop at the moment of the question being posed, because it's an issue that we've seen throughout the early church in the book of Acts, and I don't know that we've ever dealt with it head on. Today is today. But we'll be reading the first 5 verses of Acts chapter 15. Listen for the word of God. Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved." Well, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. This news made all the brothers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Then some of the believers, who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
According to our order of worship, you're not supposed to hear this. But according to my being a preacher, you probably are. So that's just got left out. There is a sermon today in honor of its invisible nature in the bulletin. I'll keep it short. As I said, it's a question we haven't dealt with. I want to kind of give you a little bit of history. And like everybody else, the history that I'm most familiar with is my own. You may or may not know, before I was honored to serve as the supply pastor for New Beginning Church here in Spring City, I was the founding pastor of Hope Fellowship Church outside of Chickamauga. Hope Fellowship was particularized, it's the church word for it, as a particular congregation within the Evangelical Presbyterian denomination in March of 2008. And that itself was remarkable enough, because we had just started in about 9 or 10 months earlier, in May of 2007, with throughout the summer a series of monthly preview services, we called them, and then we began meeting full-time in September. And to be recognized as a church, well, we thought we had arrived. We were there. All of our hard work that had gone into it, wow, that was something. And it had been quite a ride. We had started the church in Walker County, and we were very much in the midst of offering Walker County what they were comfortable with. We said from the beginning our church was going to be focused on helping people follow Jesus, and all the other things weren't going to matter so much. And we were very successful in attracting a number of people who had given up on church. They quit going some time back, years ago. They had gotten tired of the church being embroiled over controversies that to them were insignificant. Churches have a habit, don't they, of making some things eternally significant that only they could see the eternal significance of. And they had just given up. But they really wanted to be in a church. They wanted to worship. They wanted to be a part of a congregation. And they were happy to find what we had at Hope Fellowship. We had begun, almost by necessity, in a very informal manner. We had chosen a contemporary style of service. That is to say, we were musically, we were driven by a band every Sunday, and relied heavily on a lot of visual resources, recognizing that the culture is very visually in tuned. We were liberal in using them. And we met in a very informal place, the agricultural building of the Walker County Civic Center complex. We lovingly referred to it as the Cow Palace, which is what it was, a building built to show cattle. A big, open, concrete floor, housed by a metal building, and a couple of rooms off to one side. That was it. It was hard to be formal or anything like that. People brought their pets to church. Yeah. I was talking to Larry and Dorothy about this, and I said, you got to remember, we're in Walker County. And we have the cowboy church down there. So It's just a different world, y'all. But things had gone very well. We had grown, and now we were a church. And not just any church, a particular church. And not just any particular church, a Presbyterian church. And the other interesting thing about Hope Fellowship is we had started and had increased our numbers with a number of folks who had a much more charismatic background in their religion history than do most Presbyterians. And we said from the get-go, we're not interested in how you worship. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to do what we do. And you're going to come. You come and just be comfortable, and we don't care. And so we could put up with a little hand raising, That was okay. Episcopalians do that, don't they, Jerry?
They do.
Yeah, okay. So Episcopalians do it, it must be okay. But then occasionally somebody would get up and dance in the middle of a worship set.
We do that too.
Not the Episcopal church I've been in. And before you know it, it became obvious that some people didn't care for people worshiping that way. And while we never made an announcement, we officially said, that doesn't matter. You want to get up and dance? Get up and dance. You want to roll on the floor? I guess that's okay too. Fortunately, nobody did. But it became obvious that there were those that did not like it. And it became obvious to the folks that worshiped that way. And slowly but surely, they began to trickle away. Oh, as I talked to them, they all had the same story to tell me. God told me I needed to move on. What I knew the answer was, that's how charismatics explain things, okay? And that's all right. It's no different. They don't work any different from you and I. They just speak about it differently. Just like they worship differently. But I knew what they were saying was that God told me to leave because my church home wasn't my church home anymore. I didn't feel welcome here. I didn't feel like I could be myself here. I didn't feel like I was the person that God made me to be and could do that here. And Hope Fellowship entered into a period of decline because they lost the support of some very good folks. The gospel at Hope Fellowship was fine as long as it didn't call you to embrace people who worshiped differently than you did. But before I was the founding pastor of Hope Fellowship, I was the interim pastor at Chickamauga Presbyterian Church. Came to them in a dark time. They had gone through a fight over moving to property they had bought, and they split right down the middle, voting almost 50-50 as to whether or not to move the congregation. They had got all up in arms. They weren't speaking to each other. Well, this is how churches work. Don't shake your head like you've never seen that before. Of course that's how churches, it's how we work everywhere else in our life. Why wouldn't the church work like that? God hasn't managed to erase our humanity yet. And then they called a pastor that everybody could agree was awful, and they ran him off in less than a year. And so that brought some of the unity back. At least they could sit together in the same pew. They couldn't talk about things, but they could live with each other. And I walked into that with directions from the presbytery to get their leadership on board and get them started in a new church. And we went through the interim process, and I thought it was obvious, and the session quickly agreed after we did this, talked with people, did all the things we're supposed to do to hear people out. Why make it an either or? Let's just, instead of moving a church from point A to point B, let's just add a church over here and have one at point A and point B. Well, everybody thought that was a pretty good idea. We could live with that. And live with it we did just great. And in 2006, the denomination so angered the leadership of the congregation that they decided there was no way we can continue this. Let's study this for a while and we'll leave. Hope Fellowship still moving along. But towards the end of 2007, when we started worshiping every week at Hope Fellowship, the leaders of the congregation decided to keep the small church in town just like it was, only make it go to worship at a different time. 9:30 instead of 11. That would give the fledgling startup church the best opportunity to continue and grow, because it was in a much better position, really, to do that than the Chickamauga Presbyterian Church was. And that split the congregation. A handful of folks stayed in the PCUSA, in the Chickamauga Presbyterian Church. and the leadership and most of the folks that were active left and started with Hope Fellowship. The gospel of the Chickamauga Presbyterian Church could not embrace a change in time to go to church. Before I was the interim pastor at the Chickamauga Presbyterian Church, I was a co-pastor of the Grace Presbyterian Church, brought about by a merger of two churches, one of which I was the pastor. I won't go into that. Suffice it to say that it took 3 years for the church to run itself into the ground in that merger. My last-ditch effort on their behalf was to leave. And I told the leadership, maybe if together these two congregations can find their own leadership, they can move forward. They couldn't. They were the merger of the Bartlett Presbyterian Church, which I had served for about 13 years at that point. Don't think I'll go into Bartlett. It's a very healthy, thriving congregation. And the Raleigh Presbyterian Church historically had been a much larger congregation. The Raleigh church was built in the 60s, I suspect, I think along about in there, in an area of Memphis that was the area to move to if you were doing well and looking for a good suburb. The Raleigh Springs Mall was the class of the Memphis malls. 4 anchor stores. Right across the street. Big boulevard. The Raleigh Presbyterian Church was blowing and going throughout the 60s and 70s. And like all good Presbyterians, 10 years too late, they decided they needed to do something to embrace the growth. And the congregation, many of them thought it would be wonderful to build a larger sanctuary because, after all, we have to go to church at 2 different times now because we all can't fit together in the same sanctuary. And the pastor and some others in the congregation thought, wouldn't it be great if we could build a building that would help us minister to the people in the neighborhood that we can't get to because we don't have the space for them now? And that's what they did. They built the Christian Life Center to die for. It was wonderful. Full gymnasium with a stage on one end so it could be used as an auditorium. Running track on the upper level around the gym. Showers and lockers. A game room that housed ping pong and pool tables along with its own separate small kitchen. A full-blown Ruby Tuesdays commercial kitchen. They had everything. And when they got it built in the late 80s, they forgot to notice that the neighborhood around them was changing. And it was doing the kiss of death for a church in Memphis. It was changing racially. It was going from white to black. They had an opportunity to do something no other Presbyterian church and hardly any others had done at all. And that is to change with the neighborhood. They had an opportunity to hire a black staff person to run that Christian Life Center so that it would truly reach out to the neighborhood, and to plan in the future for having a black minister, and to understand that what would most likely happen was that church would go from majority white to majority black. They chose not to. And in 10 years, before they even had the building paid off, they came to the painful conclusion that they could no longer survive in that location, and they looked to leave. That was what brought them to seek us 4 miles down the road. The Raleigh Presbyterian Church's gospel couldn't cross the color line.